Chapter 8. The wagon was old and worn. When it had first been made many years ago, it had been built for hauling goods from farm to town on flat roads, not speeding through the rocky undergrowth of the forest. It squealed and rattled. The wood crunched and creaked as the weight shifted. Each noise was like a cry for mercy. Even the hay goats that pulled it seemed to feel pity for it, bleating mournfully like the parents of a dying child. Every bump and turn, it threatened to break into pieces. If it weren't for the guidance of the mask, it would have shattered to bits many times over by now. Verks was haunted by the silver shadows of his and Sneerin's crushed bodies, and the larvae become projectiles splattering against tree trunks. Every fiber of him was focused on avoiding these outcomes. Sneerin was not pleased at all. He was peripherally aware of her shrieking and whining as she clutched the sides of the vehicle in terror, accompanied by the shrill hoots of the children in the back. He wished they would stop. It was really the only thing threatening to throw them off the safe course laid out by the mask, and what a pity it would be for the young one's first lesson in irony to be their last. Sneerin was gibbering something about how cowardly Verks was being, but she had no concept of the danger they were escaping. He growled at his mate to be quiet, but she couldn't hear over herself, so he gave up. The path eventually broke out of the trees and mercifully leveled out as it merged with the trade road. Sneerin finally started to quiet down, gathering enough of herself to crawl into the back to coo the still wailing larvae. Verks drove on. The path wound away from the mountains through the undulating fields of the valley. Off in the distance to the south, the stone watchtowers and wooden gates of Zool were coming into view. Zool had been home once upon a time. It was where he and Sneerin had pupated and grown up, and where they had met. That was a lifetime ago now. It had been 10 years since they strode out of those gates for the last time, victims of a world in decay. Huntsmen of Verks's persuasion, those who hunted true prey, those who could call themselves real ghouls, were called criminals now. 40 years ago, the Goblin Queen Leda, self-proclaimed ruler of Agrima, had outlawed the consumption and production of speaking meat. Over the following decades, all the other peoples blindly gave in to her totalitarian demands. That was when the ghouls of this land were corralled into Zool, and when the walls were put up. Not long after, pressured by the threat of goblin swarms and the contempt from other races, the Beelzark of Zool had surrendered. The soul of his people was sold for peace of mind, and Verks was ripped out of his home and cast into the wilderness. To crawl back to that place, to kiss the boots of the totally Beelzark and beg for asylum, was unsavory to say the least. Not long ago, Verks would have rather died, but now things were different. Bearing seed with his maid changed everything. Those worms deserved a place like Zool, and he didn't have the heart to deny them that. They were greeted at the gates by a pair of guards playing knucklebones cross-legged on the ground. The men scooped up their game pieces and rose to their feet, unsticking their pikes from the dirt and aiming the tips at the interlopers. "Legenzuzuliatet," barked the one on the left. "Who goes there?" The men saw that the Gnurgles were ghouls and relaxed a bit. The same man lowered his weapon, saluted casually, palm out from forehead, and said, "Skrakrugza Iklio, Gazuli Nablia Kyaza." "Greetings, friends. What are your names?" Verks introduced himself and Sneerin. "Egverkza sun zivluntu niomi vo Sneerinza. Igmazulchiraz." "I am Verks, and this is my mate Sneerin. We require asylum." The guard crossed his arms and stared. The other did the same. "Azulkiyavu?" asked the first. "Asylum for what?" Verks bowed in deference. This prompted a well-deserved scoff from Sneerin, but it was necessary. "Tzachliu gar ila krauzu ablir krazavetre. Sibiu fanzila magvanjas. Igum gos rogum zagazi. Otzila vleto miengi la golivia la xolbu nklezavat." "There are many who would slay ghouls only for the sport of it. We are plagued by such fiends. Please, we beg of you, there are no others who can help wretches like us." The guards smirked and whispered to each other. The first clicked his tongue, bringing Verks' eyes to meet his own, and said, "Kloria matuavat." "Not without payment." Verks glanced at Sneerin, who shook her head. He smiled back at the guard and said, "Mos nabiguer." "Of course." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the device he'd stolen from the human. "No kavut magov megaves, ischia megav," he said. "Os bagi zuli sokosmieka, no kiviel virksokvat." "A source of great magic and power. You will not find another like it in all this world." The guard tentatively reached for the device. He and his companion retreated a few steps to inspect the treasure in private. They whispered excitedly, but their sounds quickly devolved into disappointment, then to annoyance. They returned to the little wagon and handed the device back to Verks. "Said the first. "This is a human invention." Verks waited for more, but there was none. He heard Sneerin make an exasperated noise. Before she could berate him, the second guard spoke up. He was sniffing the air. "Zeto loco, drotwa?" he said. "Do you smell that?" The first began sniffing the air too, then his eyes lit up. "Casa, toi? Is that coffee?" Verks, detached from his mane, smiled at the guards. "Ebuxiesopt, only the finest." Relieved, Sneerin giggled and leapt into the back of the wagon. She returned with a handful of dark, clean coffee grounds. She poured a sample into each of the guards' open palms. They sniffed the stuff and immediately began eating it raw. "Dankjali la solia," she offered. 2 cups of that. "Nenkilix en baikazierte." 1 for each of you. "Pervorius turali pueretre?" The second guard clarified. "For entry through the gates?" These 2 were not businessmen. Verks wondered how long ago they'd been wriggling legless and slimy in their civique. Sneerin nodded and held a conspiratorial finger up to her lips, reminding them, "Guavro mavrza." It is black gold. The guards nodded seriously, mimicking the gesture. Not 10 minutes later, the Gnurgles were rolling through the open gates into the tight, cobbled streets of Zool. The red smell of prey blood and ghoul fortitude filled Verks with nostalgia. This was unmistakably the place where he had hatched and pupated, but much had changed. Where once there had stretched great, well-maintained avenues, now sprawled a twisting, meandering tangle of filth-encrusted paths. The old roads were buried, clogged and strangled by ramshackle shops and houses haphazardly stacked and wedged together like so much trash. Looking up, the once ever-spanning sky was now all but invisible behind a teetering canopy of iron and wood. Scores of ghouls were running hither and hin. Refugees from all corners of creation swarmed the tiny plot of land like cockroaches. As they trundled deeper into town, Verks was sure he saw a handful of larvae squirming in the gutter, using the thick black detritus as civique. The misery was palpable, and he felt his lungs growing hot as the new face of Zool shamelessly revealed itself. They continued through the ship, following the directions the guard had given them. The center of town was more like Verks had remembered it. The Gothic stone administrative buildings were still standing in all their glory, mostly untouched by the filth that surrounded them. At the center stood the Hall of the Beelzark. Verks paused to curse at it before leading the cart to the office of residence. He parked and hopped down to the cobblestone. An uncomfortable feeling tickled his bowels as his feet hit the ground. He clutched Sneerin's hand and put his hunting knife in her palm, wrapping her fingers tightly around it. Anyone steps toward this wagon, you cut the life out of him. She said nothing, but took the knife and held it close. Verks left her and went inside. The place was tightly packed with crates and drawers brimming with paperwork. An old Biel looked up from his cluttered desk and smiled toothlessly. He had a pinkish skin tone that was unfamiliar, but he was a ghoul, and Verks returned the smile. They got to talking about the state of Zool. The man was Vold stock and seemed genuinely moved by Verks' plight. He asserted at one point. Goblin meat tastes bad anyway. Let the dirt have him. Verks disagreed. He would take Mir Ziegel over Gullyweasel any day, but he laughed and nodded anyway. The kind old man was able to find them a shack in the corner by the northmost tower. It was small and flanked on all sides, including the roof, by other shacks, but it was quite nicely built. They were moved in before noon. Without a yard of any kind, there was no place for the hay goats. After some deliberation, they decided to sell the male and keep the female in the corner of the house for milk. Sneerin made a goat for sale sign and hung it outside. She'd barely stepped back in when the neighbor above them descended to make an offer. They got a pretty penny for the goat, along with an invitation to try the man's cooking sometime. Not much later, their neighbor to the left came to greet them, introducing himself as Moors. He was a carpenter by trade and offered to build some furniture for the new tenants free of charge if they provided the wood. They thanked him with a scoop of coffee, which he accepted graciously. They began tearing apart the old wagon later that afternoon. Moors was able to craft an indoor fence to keep the goat in her corner and spent the rest of the evening building a safe and comfortable crib for the larvae. Moors was a likable man. No Biel Kela, the old Gnurgle senior might have said. A real man's man. He was from a tribe over the mountain that had been raided and dissolved by the guard 3 years ago. He said as he hammered a plank into a joint, for the unforgivable crime of being ghouls. Watched my brother's larvae get ate by a black wolf. Tore him to shreds. He showed no outward signs of grief, but grew quiet. On pratsub zieb zazulitwa? Asked Sneerin. Is your brother here?
Vazbobstrid. Kasu Niwaku. Alkis Hielotrele.
Went south, him and his mate. Wanted water and sun.
Egosayor to Kliogosaxios.
I say they deserve it. He nodded thoughtfully before striking a second board into its own joint.
So kirtvat to zivlo kozengos krurmos, ninkasaxios o coaxios vat.
Not so sure this world cares much what one deserves or doesn't. Burke snorted in agreement. Morris held a short peg up to the light and measured it with his eyes.
Izulto bielzark extas,
He began. Take this Beelzark.
O bielorganzea avrir sofikika. Ictore batem zulios macreliexi, bizilevat. On babgza, on vermix to sorobra. Kabosi abmed.
The man was born in Golden Civic. Never took a step outside these walls, not really. Daddy dies, baby gets the throne, no question. He took a crescent blade and shaved a few layers off the peg before putting it in place.
Ectoglust miastioso colgietre, nos calfac zigl cruolios bialaxica. Gozaos sanjiguliaca. Cagosobru, to leda to piole quierectos, quica to biorvicrio.
I bet my tongue that he's speaking me in that palace. It's in our blood. He lets Leda control his people, but why should he obey? Verx's blood boiled at the thought of that.
Kirtie lo lovnzabizia buvat.
Surely that can't be true. Morse cocked an antenna with his eyebrow.
Zetochaptorus tembrufcatras, tavro lovn torexes a genergal, ectospexolectas.
You want to live in the dark? Then that's your right, Nurgle. I choose to see. Verx held back a snarl. What did this woodworker know of sight? He thought about pulling out the mask and showing Morse a thing or two, but he kept still.
Zezaprofli albizio.
You're probably right. Morse grunted apathetically. He leaned back and stretched, having finished with the crib.
Gono bialak zavat, go to vermila sersokos punsiavex.
It isn't a palace, but it'll keep the children off the ground.
Koskiupraza,
Said Sneerin.
Zavat Kodim?
It's wonderful, isn't it, dear? Verx nodded, bowing to the true craftsman that sat before them.
Zulietre to Cornila nos megar vorculios.
For this, I shall bring you the horns of a great buck. The man spat at the notion.
No chred guli danka zavat, biel. Igem sai to ivia tron prepta zulius jovka.
There is no debt between us, Biel. We three walk the same path in this life. He stood and faced the wall in the direction of the city center and bowed, holding his palms out, wrists and thumbs touching and fingers curled in the shape of a spider, the sacred sign of the keeper.
Banto pies gulieos bielzarki zulierza,
He cried mockingly. All our fealty to the Beelzark of Zul. Everyone laughed. There had been a delirious moment upon waking where Alan had worried that last night had been some kind of dream. Now he was about to see some real magic, and he was pumped. Just in case, he pinched himself. A little too hard. Ouch. Kenneth glanced at him sideways, but ultimately ignored the outburst. Heartless led them further down the hall, away from the kitchen, to another stairwell, this one leading downward. To Jake's apparent disappointment, the vampire girl returned to her station in the lobby. The Earthlings followed the masked man once again, this time deeper underground. At the bottom of the stairway was another hallway running parallel to the one they'd come from. Compared to the floors above, the place was clinical and more practical, illuminated by steely blue fluorescent lights. Along the right-hand wall were a few doors which seemed like closets. On the left, about halfway down, was a single pair of iron doors. Heartless marched them briskly toward these and swung them open. Alan was struck by a potpourri of smells. The most easily identifiable were ozone, embalming fluid, and something like the bottom of a rat cage mixed with fish food. It was unlike any laboratory he'd ever seen. Cages, tanks, and terrariums containing small animals filled one half of the room. Rats, birds, insects, and a dozen other unknown species chittered and squawked wildly as the visitors entered. One tank seemed to be filled with glimmering bluish bubbles shaped like abstract dismembered body parts. They floated around, orbiting each other, temporarily forming vaguely humanoid shapes and then dissipating. It looked like they moved under some force of will, swapping parts and swirling around like dancers at some phantasmagorical dream party. As Alan leaned in for a closer look, he could hear them singing nonsensical streams of words in English.
From of my was dust carrying they hers and that dog dragged him as we said chest the thanks back except he threw killed was as you at work.
It was utter nonsense. Heartless called the bubble creatures sylph, but marched forward without explaining any further. The rest of the room was an anachronistic mess of occult artifacts contrasted against odd mechanical apparati and homebrewed chemical/alchemical setups. In rows along the walls were magnetic stirrers, autoclaves, incubators, and tangles of tubing hooked to bubbling flasks, all of it spinning, humming, and churning with activity. In the far left corner was some sort of office area with a pair of desks, a file cabinet, some kind of wardrobe, and a few rolly chairs. Sitting in one of these chairs was a short, balding man working fervently on some mechanical device. As they drew closer, it became clear that this was not a small human, but rather a large goblin. He did not look up as they approached. Heartless held a finger to the lips of his mask and crept toward the goblin. At about a meter away, still unnoticed, he leapt forth and shouted, "B!" The goblin looked only mildly startled. He fumbled the device he was holding, but caught it with his knees. He covered the bald spot on his head, saying, "A bee? Where?" Heartless laughed fraternally and clapped the goblin on the shoulder.
Everyone, this is Brainless, or B for short.
He then introduced the Earthlings. Brainless lowered his hands and smiled in relief. As his fingers slid away from the bald spot, they revealed a gnarly, arc-shaped scar around a frighteningly deep indentation in his skull. Alan felt a little sick looking at it. The goblin regarded each of them through thick-lensed goggles that magnified his eyes eightfold. He turned a knob on the side and the lenses refocused, bringing his eyes down to a less comical size. "Hello," he said.
Nice to meet you, said Kenneth, stepping forward with a hand extended.
B recoiled slightly, but seemed to gather himself, gripping Kenneth's hand and shaking it furiously. Kenneth laughed nervously.
"It's good to meet you too, kid,"
Brainless croaked.
"Hold this, would you?"
He placed a screwdriver in Kenneth's hand and returned to working on the device in his lap. Kenneth stood there waiting for a few moments. Finally, Heartless took the screwdriver and chuckled.
"He'll do that sometimes."
"Is he all right?" asked Alan.
"Oh yeah, for sure," said H. "He's been like that as long as I've known him."
"What happened?" Heartless shrugged, saying,
"God knows,"
before redirecting their attention to one of the nearby desks.
"Check this out."
He opened a drawer and withdrew a small pair of goggles not unlike the ones on B's face. He handed them to Jake, who was nearest.
"Try it on."
Without hesitation, Jake took the goggles and strapped them around his face. His eyes were obscured by opalescent domes, but they were clearly seeing something astounding. He looked all around the room, jaw gaping. Psychedelic. He looked Kenneth up and down, who instinctively stepped back. Jake guffawed and looked away. He stared at the ground for a moment before taking an oddly tentative step forward as if unsure of his footing. He grinned and turned to Heartless, then frowned and furrowed his brow. "What is it?" asked Alan. "What are you seeing?" Jake just laughed and took off the goggles. "No, you wouldn't be interested." "Shut the hell up," said Alan, reaching for the device. Jake smiled mischievously, but handed them over. Alan strapped them to his own face. It was incredible. The world became a funhouse of multicolored glass. Everything was translucent. Jake's insides were unveiled before him. Muscles, organs, blood vessels, and skeleton became visible. His eyes looked wide and frightening behind jelly eyelids, his mouth a skeletal grin. Alan let out a mad giggle and looked about the room. There were no more shadows, no visual secrets of any kind. The contents of drawers and cupboards were all clearly visible. The walls were panes of glass in the shape of masonry. Beyond was dirt turned to amber, with rocks and boulders suspended like huge gray diamonds over an endless abyss. Above them were messes of crystalline roots that snaked up, merging together before branching out again into the sky. In the middle distance was an enormous network of tunnels and chambers stretching on for what seemed like miles. Scurrying to and fro through these tunnels were hundreds, probably thousands of little creatures. He couldn't be completely certain at this distance, but Alan was sure they were goblins. He looked at Heartless as Jake had done. It was clear why he had looked so confused. "You're opaque," he said, removing the goggles to see H's visage unchanged. Heartless laughed and his mask winked.
"Well, naturally, why wouldn't I be?"
Alan wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he shrugged and offered the goggles to Kenneth, who shook his head. "You gotta try it."
"Let me guess," said Kenneth. "Magical X-ray specs?"
"They totally are."
"No thanks, I'm good."
"Are you serious right now?"
Alan thrust the goggles toward him.
"You have no idea what you're missing."
"Of course you don't have to," said Heartless.
"Better you don't,"
muttered Brainless. Heartless took the device back from Alan and put it away.
"So," said Kenneth, "you didn't show us that for no reason."
You're absolutely right, said H. That creature Jake saw was wearing a mask, right?
Yeah, it was.
That creature was most likely a ghoul named Verksgenurgle. The mask it wore was designed by me. Unlike this little trinket, he held up the goggles, that mask is vastly more advanced.
And if it fell into the wrong hands, Alan posited.
Well, it kinda did fall into the wrong hands, Sage continued. Not much worse you can get than a man-eater.
Manticore, said Brainless. Heartless continued.
Needless to say, retrieving that mask is extremely important.
And you need our help to do it, Jake suggested.
What? No. How old are you, 17?
16, but Ken's 18. Heartless shook his head.
No, that would be incredibly reckless.
Then why tell us all this?
He shrugged. I thought you'd appreciate some context.
I'm sure we'd be able to help in some way.
Kenneth scratched his neck. My priority is getting back home.
Heartless appeared thoughtful for a moment.
Well, he said finally, we really aren't supposed to let anyone pass through the gateway under any circumstances.
But
I can make some calls. If you really want to help, I'm sure we could work something out with the guard. Nothing dangerous, of course. I already have an associate that specializes in these sorts of things.
Alan grinned at the others. Jake looked ready to go skydiving. Kenneth looked nervous as hell.
In any case, Sage went on, you're all welcome to stay with us indefinitely. Trolls can't fit through the doors, and everybody else owes us a favor or two. It's safe enough for my liking, at least. Consider yourselves at home.
That's extremely kind of you, said Kenneth. H waved the compliment away.
It's just what we do here.
A noise erupted from his pocket, an odd, whooping, theremin-like hum. He pulled out a blue pocket mirror, almost the exact same as the one Alan's mom used to do makeup in her car, and flipped it open. He tapped something on it that clearly wasn't a button and held the thing up to his ear like a phone.
Hi, he said. Right. Okay. You did. He did. I see. Uh-huh. Oh, sure. I wouldn't have it any other way.
He closed the device, pocketed it, and smiled at the Earthlings.
That was my associate. She's almost here.
Who is she? Asked Alan.
An Othersider like us, he said.
Us? Kenneth blurted.
Yeah, she's from Earth.
H motioned for them to follow him back upstairs.
You should meet her. You'll get along famously.